All right, we're going to get it going. Welcome, everyone. I'm David Weil, Manager of Operations and Educational Technology at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities. Our director, Tess Jones, is under the weather today, so I'm stepping in as your host. The exhibit, Put Me Back Like They Found Me, opened at our art gallery at the Fulginetti Pavilion for Bioethics and Humanities almost a year ago on March 5th. But a week later, the pandemic forced the gallery and our campus to close. So we're very fortunate to have Daisy and two special guests with us today. Daisy Patton is a multidisciplinary artist who was born in Los Angeles to a mother from the South, an Iranian father she never met. She spent her childhood between California and Oklahoma, deeply affected by these conflicting cultural ways of being. Influenced by collective and political history, as well as memory and the fallibility of the body, Patton's work explores the meaning and social conventions of families, relationships, and storytelling. I'm going to let Daisy introduce her co-presenters, Dr. Virginia Espino, a UCLA historian who produced the film Mas Bebes, and Nilmini Rubin, who's the daughter of Mithra Ratne, one of the individuals portrayed in the exhibit. And lastly, I want to let you know about the next event in this lecture series on the intersections of race, class, and health, which is supported by the Henry and Janet Clayman Endowed Professorship in Medical Humanities. On Monday, April 12th, Dana Bowen Matthew, who was recently appointed Dean of the George Washington University Law School, will deliver a presentation. Dana is former faculty here at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities and is a leader in public health law and racial disparities in healthcare. And RSVPs are open on our website for that event. So without further ado, I want to turn the program over to Daisy. And as questions arise, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom and we'll address questions at the end of the presentation. So thank you. And Daisy, you can take it away.
All right, thank you, David. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to thank the folks at the Center for Bioethics at Anschutz, including Dr. Tess Jones, who's not here with us right now, David, of course, David Weil, and Heather Clough. I also want to profusely thank the curator for this exhibit, Simon Zelkind, who I worked with for years, starting back in 2015. And without him and his immense patience, this show would not have happened the way that it did. I now want to introduce the incredible co-presenters that are joining us today. Dr. Virginia Espino is an oral and public historian whose research focuses on health activism, motherhood, and various uses of public space. She's a lecturer at UCLA, teaching for labor studies and the Chicano, and Central American Studies Department. As a series leader on the Latina and Latino history at UCLA's Center for Oral History Research, she developed oral history projects around civil rights struggles that document the role of California Latinx community in creating social change, an invaluable archival collection accessible to scholars and the public at large. Her PhD is from Arizona State University, writing about the population control politics and reproductive justice during the 1970s. Her investigation into the history of coercive sterilization at the Los Angeles USC Medical Center provided the impetus for the documentary film Mas Bebes, for which she is producer and lead historian. Thank you, Virginia. Nilmini Rubin is our other presenter, and she is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, she led Tetra Tech's global team implementing energy and internet projects that resulted in millions of people gaining access to electricity for the first time. For 12 years, she served as a senior aide on both the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where she spearheaded the passage of legislation to provide electricity access in Africa, increase global internet access, reduce corruption through transparency, and reform US foreign assistance. She's an advisor for the Energy for Growth Hub, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, the World Economic Forum Experts Network, and more. Her article in the LA Times, a powerful essay on the sterilization of her mother, Mithra Ratne, has been just some of her advocacy around eugenics in the United States. We are so lucky to have such esteemed speakers joining us today, and I want to profoundly thank them both for joining us here. So now I'm going to begin my portion of the talk. So I'm going to stop my video and share screen here. And let me move very quickly. Great. All right. So I'm going to discuss Put Me Back Like They Found Me, my series on forced sterilization in the United States. And then we'll be followed by Virginia and Nilmini. If you haven't watched the YouTube video on the project and its installation in the Fulganity Pavilion last March, I highly recommend doing so after this conversation. We'll place a link in the chat box. David will. In 2014, I came across an article about forcibly sterilizing women in the US. Despite minoring in history, earning a master's degree, and reading the news and researching as part of my art practice, I had not known about this vast, appalling, and erased history. As I began researching, I saw certain parallels in this history to my own life. My sister and I were both born out of wedlock in Los Angeles, California, to our white mother, who at the time was still middle class. My father is Iranian, and my sister's father is a Black man from Belize. I was born just 4 short years after the Madrigal v. Quilligan case that Dr. Espino will discuss in more depth. We grew up on welfare, and as a white woman disabled with multiple sclerosis, I saw similarities to some of the women who were involuntarily sterilized. My art practice is focused on history and memory, challenging dominant narratives. I think about who we remember and why, and I'm often drawn to stories where individuals have been deliberately silenced or ignored. While I do not believe that art has the capacity to answer questions or solve social inequities, I do think it can amplify the voices of those who have already been fighting for justice and hopefully support their advocacy work. This ongoing project is at its core collaborative and built on relationships over several years with partners, such as family members and advocates like Nilmini Rubin, to the California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, a statewide organization that builds power and leadership through community education, policy advocacy, and community-informed research to achieve reproductive justice. Through their trust in my work, they introduced me to Dr. Espino. Put Me Back Like They Found Me centers the stories of cis female survivors of forced sterilization in the United States. I embroider the portraits of survivors as a nod to domestic labor, women's work, and thread as a metaphor for life. The immense time each portrait takes is an act of devotion, and the resulting portraits become devotional objects to each survivor. And I think about these women and their lives as I work. For living survivors, the work is a collaboration between the women and myself, often facilitated by partners such as Virginia and Nilmini. Each portrait is designed to contain an element the women choose themselves that has significance in their lives. For example, Maria Hurtado's portrait contains beautiful songbirds she would hear when she still lived in Mexico. In addition to the embroidered portraits, I painted text on hospital gowns with actual quotes from survivors or historians. In the exhibition, there were various quotes on the history of eugenics and forced sterilization displayed on foam core, but that'll be soon painted text onto hospital sheets. These historical texts help illuminate this history and its complexity, centering the survivors and their perspectives, while including court decisions, eugenics propaganda, contemporary social media comments, and more to show the legal and historical framework of how widespread, terrible, and present this practice has been. That's a little bit about the process of the work itself. I'd now like to briefly talk about the history and a few of the stories. In the late 19th century, scientists, critical thinkers, and some progressives started the eugenics movement, which still exists in many forms today. Eugenics sought to breed better humans through the ideas of social Darwinism, which saw upper-class white people as the only model of good genetics in the United States and beyond. Laws that sought to eliminate undesirable people through various means, most especially reproductive sterilization, emerged soon thereafter. In 1927, Carrie Buck, who had been raped at age 17 and gave birth out of wedlock and subsequently institutionalized, became the test case for legalizing forced sterilization before the Supreme Court. Eugenicists saw their terrible dreams fulfilled after the 1927 verdict. States nationwide created eugenics boards where mostly institutionalized people were subjected to sterilization. These victims were sterilized for the simple offense of being poor, disabled, or in the case of women, deemed promiscuous, whether true or not. While cis men were also sterilized during this period, the focus was put on sterilizing cis women as a means of controlling and oppressing certain communities. I'd like to read a couple of quotes that are part of the sheet pieces. The first is from Justice William O. Douglas in Skinner v. Oklahoma from 1942. He states, quote, "The power to sterilize, if exercised, may have subtle, far-reaching, and devastating effects. In evil or reckless hands, it can cause races or types which are inimical to the dominant group to wither and disappear. There is no redemption for the individual whom the law touches. Any experiment which the state conducts is to his irreparable injury. He is forever deprived of a basic liberty," end quote. I'd like to read this next quote from infamous evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, which he tweeted on February 16th, 2020. Quote, "It's one thing to deplore eugenics on ideological, political, moral grounds. It's quite another to conclude that it wouldn't work in practice. Of course it would. It worked for cows, horses, pigs, dogs, and roses. Why on earth wouldn't it work for humans? Facts ignore ideology," unquote. This last quote is from 1920s propaganda from the American Eugenics Society traveling exhibit. Quote, "How long are we Americans to be so careful for the pedigree of our pigs and chickens and cattle, and then leave the ancestry of our children to chance or to quote unquote blind sentiment," unquote. Forced sterilization is, simply put, a form of genocide. It's meant to eliminate certain people the white supremacist state deems inferior, and the surgeries, especially when done as hysterectomies rather than tubal ligations, had a higher incidence of death and complications. Elaine Tyler May, in her book, Barren in the Promised Land, notes that at least 5 women died while incarcerated in institutions during the Depression from this. Post-World War II saw eugenics boards eventually dismantled, but different communities of color became even more greatly affected. Black women in the South were so persecuted by the eugenics boards and private doctors that the procedure was nicknamed a Mississippi appendectomy, with the unnecessary procedure seen as practice for doctors. There was an infamous case involved the Relf sisters, Minnie Lee and Mary Alice in Alabama, who were only 12 and 14 years old when they were forcibly sterilized in 1973. Civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer was also sterilized without consent in 1961. Native and indigenous women in the US were also systemically targeted during the 1960s and 70s, leaving the future of some of these nations in peril. At least 25% of women were sterilized by the US federal government and its health-related agencies. And that's a very low estimate. I'd like to read this quote that is featured on one of the sheets that captures some of the horror of this genocidal practice. Quote, Marie Sanchez, Chief Tribal Judge for the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Lame Deer, Montana, having heard of these lawsuits and other similar allegations from her tribe, conducted her own investigation on her reservation and found that 30 women were sterilized between 1973 and 1976. Sanchez learned from her interviews that 2 girls under the age of 15 were told they were having their appendix taken out, only to discover later they had been sterilized. Another woman who complained to a physician about migraines was told that her condition was a female problem and was advised that a hysterectomy would alleviate the problem. Her headaches continued, however, until she was diagnosed with a brain tumor, unquote. That quote is from Sally J. Torpy's article, Native American Women and Coerced Sterilization on the Trail of Tears in the 1970s. Our next speakers will discuss how other communities have been affected. I now want to focus on one of the portraits of the gowns, on a woman named Lucille. Lucille is not a real name. She was sterilized against her will at age 17 at the Colorado State Hospital in Pueblo, despite the Colorado government explicitly forbidding forced sterilizations. An energetic and troubled child, she began running away from home at age 10 and was in and out of state-controlled schools and institutions afterwards. After being sterilized, she was released 2 months later, but suffered from post-traumatic stress for about a year. She was then sent back to the state hospital and trapped there for 7 years. She was paroled for 2 years, and she met with a state house member in 1953 to be restored to reason so she could live independently again. Lucille read, went to secretarial school, and was finally able to have stability in her life. Lucille was encouraged to sue for being forcibly sterilized, which she did within the first year after she was restored, because Colorado only allowed civil lawsuits 1 year after the event. Though she was called, quote unquote, mentally deficient during her institutionalization, she was seen by the judge and jury as intelligent and therefore had no case. She was told she should have filed suit within the year of being sterilized, which was of course impossible because Lucille was still at the state hospital then. The fallout from trauma of forced sterilization could be tremendous, as it was for Lucille. She spent the rest of her life alone. She never married or even dated, insisting no one would want her after years of being abandoned by those close to her. She described tearing up all the photographs of herself, as if she was trying to erase herself out of a sense of unworthiness and rage at what had happened to her. The past is not just present. It never left. Many judges over the past few decades have recommended sterilization to defendants as a way of decreasing their sentences, a coercion that has affected women whose charge can be as minor as check fraud, as in the case of Summer Creel in 2017. The 45th president of the United States has many times cited his quote unquote superior genes and enacted white supremacist executive orders that have reinvigorated eugenics for the 21st century. And of course, the recent news of forced sterilizations in ICE concentration camps is a horror that is still ongoing. For those of the audience that are local to the Anschutz community, there's an ICE center just a mile away from the medical campus. It should be noted that the concept of reproductive justice, a coin termed by Black women, has framed how to think about body autonomy and reproductive rights. As Dorothy Roberts states, quote, reproductive freedom is a matter of social justice, not individual choice, unquote. These women and their stories are reminders that each eugenicist belief or law has genuine tragic costs. We as a society owe these survivors and their memories our care and demand for justice, in addition to finally ending these cruel violations for present and future generations. I am still actively seeking partners and collaborators for this project. So my email is on here, but I'll show it again later at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. I'd now like to turn over the conversation to Dr. Virginia Espino, who will discuss the history of forced sterilization within Latinx communities in California and her important work with Mas Bebes. And I'm going to very quickly drop out of this because I forgot to.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank Daisy and the people from the Center for Bioethics at Anschutz and everyone who performs all the hidden work that makes events like this possible. Like Daisy, I knew nothing about the history of forced sterilization and let alone the history of Madrigal v. Killigan. So I'm just going to focus on that one case, that one episode, because the history of forced sterilization in relation to the Latinx community is a very long history. And it even goes back to, well, I wouldn't say forced sterilization. I would say the reproductive injustice that has been imposed on the Latinx community goes back to conquest and colonization of the Southwest, even before the US took power in the Southwest. So in relation to the Spanish crown and the indigenous communities in this area, lack of bodily autonomy is part of this history of this land. So I learned about this story when I was in graduate school. And even though I grew up in Los Angeles, Daisy, can I have the next slide, please? So even though I grew up in Los Angeles, very close to where these sterilizations took place, I did not learn about the Madrigal case until I was in graduate school. And I learned about this case by my mentor, Dr. Vicky Ruiz, who was a witness to what was transpiring when she was in graduate school. Dr. Vicky Ruiz is one of the early Chicana historians to emerge with a PhD in the mid to late 1980s. And she was in graduate school when this case was unfolding in the media. And she made it her mission to tell this story in her classes, to teach students about what took place. And that is how I learned about this story. I was in one of her graduate seminars in the mid-90s, and I wanted to unpack this history and learn more about it and make sure that more people would learn about it. So find a way to tell this story to a wide audience. So this is a case where ethnic Mexican women, typically they're described as immigrant women, but some of the plaintiffs in the Madrigal v. Killigan case were US citizens or had authorization to be in the United States or had been born in the United States. So it was a case of both immigrant women living in Los Angeles and US born women, as well as naturalized citizens. Some of the women spoke English and some of them spoke only Spanish. These are women who went to the LA County Hospital for the delivery of their children. And while they were in labor, they were approached about both cesarean section and tubal ligation. This is a hospital that serves mostly trauma patients, patients who come to the hospital in dire situations. And sometimes they come to the hospital because they don't have health insurance to go someplace else. The women in Madrigal v. Killigan went to have their children delivered at the LA County Hospital because they were having complications. So there was already a problem that had arose when they entered the hospital building. At the time that they were in labor, it was decided they needed a cesarean section. At the same time they were signing for that, they were asked to sign for sterilization, tubal ligation. Some of the women don't remember signing any documents. Some of the women felt pressured, forced into it. Some of the women signed but were confused about what tubal ligation actually meant or what sterilization meant. Some of the women believed that sterilization was a cleaning of the uterus, like a DNC. So there was a lot of confusion, misunderstanding, and ultimately hundreds of women left that hospital in the 1970s with an unwanted sterilization surgery. But this is a period of wide sweeping political activism. Chicana feminism is emerging as well. And you have activists clamoring for social justice, equal rights, educational opportunities, etc. Once this story hit the news, they decided that a lawsuit was needed. You have a whistleblowing doctor who's working at the hospital during this period who wants to alert the public to what's taking place. Similarly, you see a whistleblowing nurse at the ICE detention center, and that's how we learned about that case, because of her openness to come forward, even if it means losing your job or becoming demonized in the public eye. Dr. Brunel Rosenfeld serves as a whistleblowing doctor, comes forward with this case, alerts the LA Times, a lawsuit ensues, and 10 women bring case against the LA County Hospital. So my focus in writing my dissertation about this issue looked more at the role of activist mothering and the role of Chicana activist feminists. And then I was lucky to have the opportunity, and you can go to the next slide, Daisy. I was lucky to have the opportunity to meet the wonderful filmmaker, Renee Tajima Pena. And in part of my project of obtaining a PhD in history was to learn about the past, to write about it, but also to bring these hidden stories that I felt had been erased, ignored, to a wide public audience. So public history was an important goal for me. I really wanted to share narratives in the same way that Howard Zinn shares, the people's history through his work. I wanted to share these erased narratives, these ignored narratives, to people who don't have access to a very privileged university education. So I jumped on the opportunity to work on a documentary film with Renee Tajima Pena. And within that process, we uncovered new information and we were able to conduct new research. So the interviews that appear in the documentary film are interviews that I was not able to conduct myself while writing. So there's a lot of new information that comes through in this film version of the story. But for me, and I believe also Renee, we were so angered to learn about this history. We were angered that women were robbed of their right to procreate based on their ethnic heritage. We were angered at this violation. And we were especially angered at the devaluation of Mexican mothering, the ways that Mexican women mother their children. Renee Tajima Pena is Japanese American. Her family actually spent many years in imprisonment during World War II because of their Japanese heritage. She really identified with this story. I myself, growing up, Latinx, Chicanx, being discriminated against in my childhood, really identified with the fact that this group of mothers were devalued and robbed of their right to procreate. So I want to share a clip with you from the documentary film. It features Maria Hurtado, who is also featured in Daisy's work, and her husband, Salvador Hurtado. And it offers us a window into what was lost, as well as their resilience, their, what I like to call ability to sobrevivir, to overcome. But it's definitely an episode where their motherhood was interrupted because they were on their way to have more children. And that was their goal, and that was taken from them. The documentary recounts what took place in early 1970s. And what is interesting about this film is that we're able to secure the testimony of both Madrigal plaintiffs and doctors who were charged with these unwanted sterilizations. And so I think it offers us an opportunity to weigh the case and decide for ourselves what we think took place. You know, it's definitely a story with two completely different sides and two completely different interpretations of what happened. But what I learned from making this film is that the women themselves, the plaintiffs, lived with shame, lived with this secret. Many of them did not tell their husbands that they had been sterilized. And then many would go on to keep their role in the lawsuit a secret from their families and from their spouses. So by making this film, while we did not force anyone to participate, we did not pay anyone to participate, we forced the issue out into the public realm. We forced a conversation with local city officials about the role of the hospital in this forced sterilization. And we also forced families to grapple with what their mother or their grandmother had been through. And ultimately that led to this transformation in identity, in a sense of self. The women who participated in the film, many of them felt that it empowered them because it was an acknowledgement, a validation of what had taken place. Not all of them did, though, and it's important to remember that these are 10 women who participated in this lawsuit. Some of them remain traumatized to this day and did not want to participate in this documentary film. But the ones that did, most of them had a positive experience. I'll say all but one had a positive experience, and that is because the one that did not want to share her story any further had a traumatic relationship with her spouse after the sterilizations. Thank you, Daisy. So meeting Daisy, just was this continuation of acknowledgement, affirmation. It was an act against forgetting, an act against ignoring or erasing. It was a validation for the women. And so that's why I think of art as a tool for reckoning. It's a tool for education. It could be a tool for social justice. But in the case of the Madrigal women, it was really a reckoning. It was an acknowledgement that this had taken place and that there was a wrong that was committed. I know for a fact that both Maria Hurtado, pictured here, and Melvina Hernandez, pictured here, they're both featured in Daisy's exhibit. They loved meeting her. They appreciate that people want to talk to them about what they experienced. They appreciate that people want to share their stories in different ways via, newspaper print, audio, or through these wonderful art projects. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to work with Daisy on bringing these beautiful art pieces to the public and sharing this story far and wide. So now I'll leave you with that. I don't know if we'll have a chance to watch the video clip. If we don't, I'll put a link in the chat for you to watch the entire documentary film. And I'd like to turn it over to Nilmini Rubin. Thank you so much.
I'm going to try one more time, try to do some adjustments. And if it doesn't work, I'm very sorry. We tested this last night. Is it working? Ha! Hallelujah.
Me llamo María Hurtado. Me casé el 1 de enero del 61 y tengo ahorita 51 años y medio de casada. Ahora tú di.
El nombre de ella.
No, después, cuando viene la pregunta. Ahorita nomás da tu nombre.
Yo soy Salvador Hurtado.
Yo volteaba a ver al güerito Y decía yo, pues está muy flaquito, muy delgadito. Y yo estaba rechoncha. Entonces decía, oye, si lo abrazo fuerte lo voy a quebrar. Pero a las 2 de la mañana dije, ¿quién me falta por bailar? Y me faltó él. Y le dije, vamos a bailar.
Todo lo que quiero yo lo haré en la vida. La fe que me nace es por ti, mi vida. Todo lo que quiero yo lo haré en la vida.
Para serte sincera, a mí me gustó mucho el Chinguelí. Es más puritano él que yo.
Ya.
La fe que me nace es por ti, mi vida. Todo lo que quiero yo lo haré en la vida. Todo lo que tengo.
Voy al hospital, en el 5º piso, sale mi marido. Y entonces me dijeron, vamos a hacer ahorita una cosa. Acuéstate aquí. Se fueron, trajeron unos estudiantes. Ready, decían ellos en inglés. Mrs. Ready.
One of the senior residents showed us a tubal ligation book where you signed up women for a tubal ligation, and he said, I want you to ask all these girls if they want their tubes tied. I don't care how old they are. And I said, did you ask them during labor? And he said, sure, after the 8th pain. That's how it's done, isn't it?
The tubal ligation takes place at the end of the cesarean section. You've sewn the uterus up, the baby's been delivered, the mother is stable, and the tubes get tied. Cut, tied, burned, whatever was done. The idea being that these patients are not to get pregnant again.
Que tenía mucho dolor en la panza. Ay, me duele, me duele, me duele. Y el doctor me dijo, ¿qué te pasa? Y le dije, es too much pain.
I saw doctors hold up the syringe and say, you know, you want this shot? You want this shot? No mas dolor. This showing the needle. This will take away the pain. Sign. Sign.
Well, that was so powerful. Thank you, Virginia, for all your work on that movie. My mom and I both were incredibly touched by that, by No Mas Bebes. And thank you, Daisy, for your artwork and your dedication to this project. It means a lot to us. I'm Nilmini Rubin, and I'm here with my mom. I don't know if you can see her in the back here in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And I learned about forced sterilization, not really because I wanted to. It was because I was kind of angry my whole entire life that I was an only child. I was pretty lonely growing up. And I always kind of pushed, like, why am I an only child? Why am I an only child? And it wasn't until I got to college when my mom told me why. That my parents came from Sri Lanka in 1968. They came to Washington State, where my dad did a PhD. And they had me in Pullman, Washington, kind of near the Idaho border. And on the day I was born, they sterilized my mom against her will. It was 1972. And if you go to the next slide, you can see my parents with me in 1972, kind of after this happened. And then we can take it off screen share for a few minutes, and I'll just talk to the group directly. But I was really shocked. I didn't really understand, you know, the backstory about forced sterilization, how it could happen to my mom. So I did a lot of research. So Daisy, can we take it off screen sharing for a little bit? And what I realized was that this had happened to a lot of people. It wasn't just something that had happened to my mother. So I did a lot of research and learned about the history of eugenics. Thousands of people have been sterilized against their will in the United States. And I would like talk about it kind of with horror. And every time I'd bring it up, people were surprised. I went to this crazy group that got together, kind of tech people from the West Coast with policy people from the East Coast. And you're supposed to talk about something surprising for 2 minutes. So I talked about forced sterilization and my mother's experience. And everyone in the room was shocked. I mean, these are people who were in biotech and had big genetics companies. And they were like, what? They just never heard about it. So I wrote this op-ed in 2012. And I talked about how my mother was sterilized against her will in Washington State. And years later, my family moved to Palo Alto, where schools and buildings were named after eugenicists. And kind of into how more people had been sterilized in California than any other state, which I think was surprising to many. And it was just like, people were like, I mean, it wasn't that they doubted my veracity, but people were shocked. Like, a lot of people, the response would be like, I can't believe it. And people were very, very educated. And it would get these questions like, why would the doctor do that? Or why didn't your mom say no? And I think it's that they didn't understand that, like, a woman right after she gives birth, when the doctor comes in to do a procedure, can't really understand what's going on unless there's some severe situation. And it's very easy. Women are very vulnerable at that moment. So I wrote this op-ed, just to like educate people, especially people who are kind of doing work in genetics, to be kind of aware of our eugenics history so they could not repeat it. Kind of like what Daisy said during her talk, past is present. I didn't want people to repeat, the kind of the racist undertones willingly or unwillingly in their work. And it was really kind of this like historical look back but in the op-ed, I talked about how we can't really know if this is still happening. In a lot of states, it's forced sterilization is legal. Sterilization by private doctors can just happen. There's no tracking. But that was sort of like dismissed. I mean, most people were like, of course, this doesn't happen anymore. And then I was just dismayed to learn that, in fact, it was still happening. And at the end of my talk, we'll show a clip from the trailer of Belly of the Beast. But it was uncovered that, between 1997 and 2010, at least, potentially more than 1,400 women were sterilized against their will in California prisons. So this is into the 2010s. And it came out, these lawyers were able to uncover it because the California prisons were billing the insurance companies for this activity. And most of those women, most of the 1,400 women still don't know. Like, they still haven't been told that they were sterilized against their will because they were in for other procedures. They still need to match the names with the insurance numbers. And it just broke my heart that this is actually not a historical issue. It's a current issue. And it's good that we know that this was happening in the California state prisons, but really nobody's looked to see if it's happening in the other state prisons. So I certainly worry that this is a current issue. And when you watch the movie Belly of the Beast, which I do hope you'll all have the chance to do, it was really dismaying that people from the medical community were defending the potential of the rights of the doctors to choose to sterilize women, that they suggested that there was procedures that would be intact, but it is very hard to consent when you're behind bars. So I will I believe that this forced sterilization is certainly something that's touched our lives. It's the reason why I'm an only child. It's the reason why I chose to have my mom live with us while we raised our kids, so she would have the chance to be around children and enjoy them. And it makes me incredibly sad that it's a problem that we haven't fixed yet. So Daisy, if you're able to show the short trailer, I would really appreciate it. Oh, so that's the op-ed piece. So here's the trailer. And thank you, Virginia, for sharing the op-ed in the chat.
Sorry, I'm trying to click it and it's not wanting to work. Let me see.
So while we're trying to get that to work, that image was of Kelly, who was informed by a lawyer she was sterilized against her will. Like she didn't know, but it was this lawyer uncovered it when she was matching the insurance numbers with names. And in the movie, she's really the linchpin of it. It kind of chronicles how devastating it was for her to lose her ability at a young age to have more children. And the idea that this was mostly Black and brown women that this was done to is another level. This was in the movie, they also have doctors and nurses who were interviewed who had some discomfort, but some felt like they were saving the state money to sterilize women against their will, who obviously sterilization was not part of their criminal punishment, nor should it ever be. So
they did a pelvic exam.
I was told that I had cancer cells.
I had been intentionally sterilized, and I had been lied to.
Sterilization procedures have been going on for years at multiple prisons.
Hundreds of abuses every month.
We have yet to get an apology, yet to be acknowledged. We have to crack this thing wide open.
Belly of the Beast, part of Independent Lens on PBS.
They did a pelvic exam.
Well, thank you, and I'll turn it back to Daisy.
Thank you so much, Nilmini, for your really powerful advocacy work and talking about your mother, and to Dr. Espino as well. And I have a very brief slide with some contact information before I drop out of the screen sharing. Sorry for the technical stuff. I don't understand. We tested it last night, but every day. So thank you. I think now is time for Q&A.
We have a couple of questions from the audience that have come in. One is from an anonymous attendee, and their comment is, thank you for a fascinating conversation and important work. Art as a tool for reckoning is such an important insight. Creating work of this sort is not often commercial. In what ways can institutions do more to initiate collaborations with artists, thus supporting both the community and the artists? I think, Daisy, that's probably a good one for you to get started with, perhaps.
I'm not a representative for all artists, but I will say that I know that there are some institutions that do have things like residency programs, or, in the case of Anschutz, an actual space that is devoted to exhibitions that are applicable to the hospital community and the community at large. And so I think that these sort of like collaborations back and forth are really productive and can be really helpful. And, this was the debut of this series at Anschutz, and I felt like it was a perfect match for the project itself. So I think that, there's a variety of places that you can, of course, advertise some of these programs, but having them developed and, reaching out to different community members, particularly like arts community members that are working in different realms of justice-oriented work. I know, for example, in Denver, Redline Contemporary Arts Center is one of those spaces, but I think the wonderful thing is that all across the country and probably globally, there are many artists and many organizations that are very eager to collaborate in this kind of way. So it's just a matter of, creating the opportunities for the artists to come, I guess. Yeah.
I have another question from Dr. Winia. And lost him though, he slipped around. Oh, I see, it's answered. Okay. When you're talking about these experiences, how often do you find people seeking to blame the victim? That is, how common is it for people to wonder, how could you or she let them do this? Why didn't you say no? Or didn't you have to sign something? And then assuming those types of questions are pretty common and assuming they must make you angry, as they would make me angry, how do you respond in a way that's productive?
Who is that? Is that a question for someone specific, or
I think, if Virginia, if you want to try that one, that would be great. The issue of permissions.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, the issue of informed consent. One of the things that we address in the film is this idea of whether or not the women were actually informed well enough to make those kinds of decisions. Dr. Quilligan mentions in the documentary that he feels it is perfectly appropriate to ask a woman who's in labor, who's already had 4 to 6 children, I can't remember the number, if she wants tubal ligation. And we're arguing that, is it really possible to make an informed decision when you're in labor about tubal ligation surgery? So informed consent is something that medical professionals are now thinking about after having seen the documentary No Mas Bebes. We've screened at many medical schools, so I'm really proud of that fact. That was an unexpected bonus.
I've certainly heard a lot of people say like, oh, well, why didn't your mom fight back? And I think it's just this complete lack of understanding of power dynamics and like what the vulnerability of a woman in a hospital. And when a doctor decides to do something to her, there's very little that a woman can do in that situation. And also when, signing pieces of paper when you're under distress is, it's hard to call that actually consent, because it's, so many times you don't read the whole thing anyway, but there's a lack of communication. And certainly my mother wasn't properly informed of what was happening.
Another question from Lynn Perry. Again, not directed to any of you, so feel free to jump in, but thanks for a powerful presentation. Government funding has tremendous power, whether it is preventing abortions or forcing unwanted sterilization. How do we develop appropriate patient-centered help for women?
That's a very big question. And that question has both national and global implications when we're talking about women's health. You know, we think about, that just reminds me of the story of Selena Williams when she was delivering her child and what took place when she felt her life was in danger and the doctors were not responding to her because as a Black woman, she was viewed as somebody who was complaining irrationally. So we really need to change the way that medical students are trained. You know, in some schools, they're not trained to perform abortions or to terminate a pregnancy because of the politics. So we definitely need an overhaul of how medical students are trained and the value that we place on medicine when it relates to urban areas, rural areas, areas where community of colors reside. I think this pandemic is really exposing all the holes in our public health system.
I think it would be helpful. I think training would be wonderful. I think also a full review, you know, having the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, look into what's actually happening in federal prisons to see if this is occurring. Having every state look to see if it's happening in their state prisons, and having at the state level, the American Medical Association and other ACOG and other medical groups actually do trainings for people to understand consent and reproductive rights. Because there has definitely been comments made to me, even with my mother having been sterilized against her will, with people trying to justify it, saying, well, you know, these people shouldn't have more kids, or they're on welfare, they're costing the state money. You know, it only seems fair that they should be sterilized. And it's incredibly shocking and wrong. And it's against not just the, you know, kind of the moral fabric, but it's against international human rights law. Even though it's forced sterilization was deemed legal in the United States by the Supreme Court in the Carrie Buck case. It's hard to undo that Supreme Court case without another case to take to the Supreme Court, but it's certainly possible to change the laws in every state to say that sterilization against your will is not legal. And it's one of those things where people are like, oh, well, isn't that true already? But it's not.
Well, I want to be mindful of time, and we have run out of it. So I want to thank Daisy and Virginia and Nilmini so much, and thank you for everyone who attended. A recording will be on our website, coloradobioethics.org. And thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.